All good land has problems. And so if you're buying a piece of property, it's not a question of if, but when you're going to uncover some issue with that land that you're buying. But not all problems are created equal. And deal breakers are the problems that are so big and expensive to fix that if you don't find those deal breakers before you close the purchase on that land, it is all but guaranteed that you're going to lose money. I bought hundreds and sold hundreds of pieces of land across the United States and made over $2.5 million of cash profit in that process. And every single property I bought, I was able to sell for a higher price than I paid for it when I bought it. The only reason that's even possible is because I know what the 7 deal breakers are. Because of that, I was able to avoid them on the properties that I was buying before I closed the deal. So let's get started by showing an example of the first deal breaker when buying land. And I'm going to show this example by telling you a story. This is a 1-acre piece of land in a little town called Whiteville, North Carolina. It's accessed via a dirt road on Leeler Lyons Drive. This is a dirt road that runs east to west on the southern edge of a field. And as you get into this subdivision, you see that it hits a block of building lots and it splits and goes north to south. On the southern edge of this subdivision, you see a couple homes that use Leeler Lyons Drive for ingress and egress. And as you go to the north, on the western edge of that field, what you can see is that our property is one of several that are able to access their individual properties by the private drive that then runs on the western edge of that farmland. All the neighbors in this subdivision are using the same exact road to get to their properties, including the neighbors that have actually built their homes in this subdivision. This is a property that we got a really low price to buy it. In fact, we were going to buy it at $2,000, thinking that we would then flip it on the open market for about 10 grand to a buyer that would use it to actually build a manufactured home. There was just one problem though. You see, we were going through the research on this property, pulling old deed records, pulling old plat maps, survey maps, and every single reference that we found for Leeler Lyons Drive referred to an old farm road. Some referred to an old soil road. But what we couldn't find in the process of going through all these old documents was anything like an easement. We couldn't see any right-of-way that had ever been recorded to show that the neighbors that crossed through Leeler Lyons Drive actually had a right to use that property to get in and out of their homes. But then again, when you scrutinize it, you see that all the neighbors are using this very same farm road. So what's the big deal? I mean, if the neighbors are using it, it should be fine, right? Well, I don't know. Maybe the neighbors know the farmer. Maybe the neighbors know Leeler Lyons. Maybe they are part of the Leeler Lyons family, or they have some other private agreement that's been documented in some safe or lockbox somewhere that we don't see, that was not recorded via the county register of deeds. I don't know what their arrangement is or if they have an arrangement at all, but here's what I do know. If we were to buy that 1 acre of land, no matter how good of a deal that we got on it, if we went to sell it, the person that would buy that land from us would close through a local real estate attorney. And if they did that, that local real estate attorney would run a title search. When that real estate attorney ran a title search, they would see that there's no easement to that land. And they would know that their client, who is the buyer, that has specifically hired them to manage the risk of the transaction of buying this property, that person would want to know the fact that this land is landlocked, that there is no easement. They'd want to know the fact too that if they ever planned on building that manufactured home on that property, that no mortgage lender would ever approve the loan, because no mortgage lender would ever see that farm road and mistake it for a right-of-way, because there is no right-of-way. Is an attorney really going to let their client knowingly buy a property that's landlocked without making a fuss about it? I don't think so. So the question is, what good is having a driveway like this if you don't even have the right to use it? Or like in this next property, if you're allowed to use the driveway, but only after you build it, only after you pay the cost of actually constructing the driveway yourself. If you look at this 1 acre property, this is a property that appears to be landlocked. It's about 600 feet north of the county road to the south. And it looks to the untrained eye like this is a piece of land that you cannot get to both legally or physically. But when you actually scrutinize the public records, what you find is that there is a right of way. Looking at the eastern boundary, or the eastern edge of this piece of land, going south to the county road, you actually see that there's a right of way. It's a roughly 30-foot wide right-of-way going the 600 feet to the property from the county road. So you have legal access here, but the problem is you don't have physical access. So to get to that property, you would have to cut down those trees. You would have to flag the perimeter of the easement to even know what trees that you were allowed to cut down. And once those trees were cleared, the land would have to be graded and the driveway would have to be installed. But that driveway is going to cost you about $30,000 if you're lucky, which means that the driveway is going to cost more than this land is worth. See, See, the price impact of this type of undeveloped easement is huge, because if this same property were located along that county road to the south, it would be worth about $40,000 on the market, give or take. But see, with the current access, it might have a difficult time even selling for 10 grand. So the $30,000 cost differential of building that driveway is huge, because the first deal breaker when buying land is access. If you have a property that does not have legal access, if you cannot get to that land without illegally trespassing on the neighbor's property, you can't buy that land. If you ever want to use it, if you ever want to build a home, if you ever want to get a loan, it's completely out of the question. And the other deal breaker for vacant land is physical access, because if you have an undeveloped easement that has not yet been cut in, you have to be the one to pay for that driveway. Now, that's not always a deal breaker, but it is unless you can negotiate for the cost of cutting in that driveway plus another 15-20% cost buffer, because you're going to have to manage that project on your own. We're going to get to the second deal breaker, but before we do, if you're looking for a proven checklist to make sure you're covering all your bases when buying land, check out the link in the description, download the free checklist. I think you'll appreciate it. Now let's take a look at the second deal breaker when buying land, because believe it or not, it's funny, you wouldn't expect it, but a lot of people own land even though they don't exactly know where the boundary lines are. But sometimes when they do know where the boundary lines of the property they own are located, the problem is that the neighbor next door does not. The neighbor next door has used some of the property that you own for their own personal use. So let's take a look at this example. This is a 20.7 acre property. It's what's called a flag lot. You see that narrow access point, that driveway that goes south to north and touches up against that main road. But when you look on the western edge of that driveway, you can see that the neighbor to the west has apparently set up shop across your property line. In fact, they've put a bunch of junk out there in the woods, out there in their backyard, and chances are some of that junk's actually on your property. This is what is called an encroachment. An encroachment is when a neighbor without your permission uses some of your property for their own benefit. Now, the process of actually determining whether this encroachment is real is, number one, to get a survey. You got to get a survey of this land to make sure that on that western boundary line, it is where you think it is. Because once you have that boundary line flagged, you can see whether or not the neighbor's stuff is truly across the property line. If it is, you send them a letter to give them notice that they have encroached on your property. And then if they don't budge, that's basically a civil litigation process. And you're the one that owns that land and you have rights, but you still got to push it through the courts if you can't work it out with the neighbor directly. But sometimes when you think you have an encroachment, appearances can be deceiving. Take a look at this property here. This is a half acre in Sampson County, North Carolina, where when you look at the county maps, you can see that the western boundary line of our subject property here appears to have an encroachment from the manufactured home to the neighbor that the neighbor owns to the west. You can actually see what appears to be a section of that home that hangs over the property line. But what was interesting about this is when you actually look at the backyards and the fence lines of a lot of the neighboring homes in this subdivision, what's curious is that some of the fence lines in the satellite image are shifted relative to the actual property lines. So it looks like there's like a 7 or 8 foot shift of the satellite image relative to the GIS mapping lines. So is it possible that every neighbor is encroaching on the neighbor to their next door by the same exact amount? Or could the county maps be wrong? Well, in this case, the answer is yes, the county maps were wrong, and the surveyor that went out gave us a partial boundary survey and confirmed on our property there was no encroachment. And so we were able to sell this land. We just closed a couple of days ago after a fairly lengthy sales process, because some buyers still thought that the encroachment was real, but when we showed them the survey, the partial boundary survey, they were satisfied with the evidence that there was no encroachment. So don't take it at face value and understand you got to get a surveyor out there if you want to prove it one way or the other. Sometimes the issue with a boundary on a piece of property has nothing to do with encroachment or suspected encroachment. Sometimes the issue on a boundary is that the owner of that property doesn't even know where the boundary is. Reminds me of this 6.5 acre property that we flipped a couple years ago. We had bought it. We got it surveyed after we bought it. And then we put it on the market. We had a buyer who was in the process of closing on that property on the other side. So we were actually selling it now. When we were selling it, we were a couple weeks out from closing, and I got an email from the buyer's attorney. And the attorney said, "Hey, I saw this hatched area on the survey map. So what do you guys want to do about that? Is that a gap or is that an overlap between the two properties?" I was like, what? I didn't even know what he was talking about until I went and pulled the survey map and I saw it. And you see this hatched area on the survey map, this cross-hatched area. It's a discrepancy because the surveyor that got that property surveyed didn't quite know exactly where the northern boundary line was, because there was some disagreement between the northern boundary line of our property and the southern boundary line of the property of the neighbor to the north. And ironically, the neighbor to the north was the guy that we bought that land from. So this was a hatched area, and on the survey notation it said hatched area appears to be a potential gap, an apparent discrepancy between deed call and monuments found on the ground. And when I asked the surveyor what the attorney asked me, namely if it was a gap or an overlap, the surveyor didn't know. It was just some ambiguity that he couldn't close out on the survey project that he did for us. And so what we ended up having to do is I contacted the neighbor to the north, and we got a quitclaim deed from that neighbor saying that, look, I don't have anything to do with that area, that crosshatched area. I'm releasing any claims of that section of the land because as far as I'm concerned, I've sold that to you guys when you bought that land to the south. He was the coolest guy in the world because a lot of sellers wouldn't have responded to that message. A lot of sellers wouldn't have helped us out. Not because they're bad people, but you know how people are. When they're done with you, when they don't need anything from you, they're kind of done with you and they'll just let your email go. They're not going to help you. But this guy did, and a lot of sellers will, but you got to make sure that you spot this in advance because we almost got burned on this thing. Because a lot of buyers could get spooked if they don't know exactly where the property lines are. It's a little sketchy. But the idea is on this one, it wasn't enough of an area of the land that it made much of a difference. So the buyer ended up closing, which was lucky. See, if the land that you're buying hasn't been surveyed in a long time, sometimes the boundary lines are less clear than you would assume. And a lot of times surveys from two adjacent properties that border one another actually disagree with each other. They're not on the same page about where the boundary lines are. These types of gaps and overlaps are very, very common. How could they not be? Because if you really think about it, surveying as a science, it's an imperfect science. Because what you're trying to do is you're trying to do something that is inherently impossible. You're putting a two-dimensional map onto a three-dimensional surface. So there's always going to be some lack of accuracy and some issues in terms of the fidelity of these surveys. The second deal breaker, guys, is boundary issues, because you have to know where your boundaries are, because what you're buying is what's within the boundaries. Land is location. Location is determined and defined by the boundary lines around the property, and everything in the middle is what you're buying. So you have to know where the boundaries are. If you think you have an encroachment, get a surveyor to at least do a partial boundary survey on that boundary line and make sure you know if there's an encroachment at all, and if so, how much, and try to get it resolved with that seller before you buy the land and get them to pay for it too. If you have an overlap or a boundary gap issue like the one that we mentioned, those are a little bit harder to fix. So if you can get the neighbor on the other side to quitclaim that disputed area to you, that's going to be helpful. Or at the very least, if you buy that land and there's a gap or an overlap, just assume that any lands that are disputed are not going to be able to be usable, and just figure out, is what's left over enough to make good on the purchase and justify the value of what I'm buying. Because if you can just be cautious and conservative, you're not going to get burned too bad on some of these overlaps. But sometimes when you're buying land, there's no boundary line issues because everything about the land that you're looking at is totally perfect. Look at this 2.8 acres. It's an idyllic home site. It's a great home site with incredible natural features, big open field, a curtain of trees around the perimeter, big open space in the middle. Everything about this piece of land is perfect except one thing, and that one thing is soil. Because when we sent out to get a soil scientist to go review this property to make sure that we could put a septic system on it, the soil is completely unsuitable for septic. You can't put a septic system in, which means you cannot build a home on this land. And whenever you can't build a home on a piece of residential land like this, you're losing between 60 and 80% of the market value of that property. This is a piece of land that would probably be worth on the order of $38,000 on the open market with a single septic system. But without that septic system, the market value is probably about 10 grand, or maybe 12, 14K if you sell it to a farmer. Guys, the third deal breaker is soil. If you do not have sewer service on the property that you're buying, then you have to install a septic system. But it's not enough to know whether or not you can install a septic system. It's, can you install a conventional septic system? If so, how many bedrooms of a home can that septic system support? Because if you have unsuitable soils, you can't put any septic systems at all. And if you have marginal soils, you can only put in an expensive engineered septic system like a mound system or an aerobic drip system. And those are going to take your septic installation cost from $7,500 to well north of $35,000. So you got to make sure that you understand how much it costs to put that septic system in, and if you can or if you cannot. And if there's any additional cost on the septic system, you want to make sure that the seller understands what's going on, because when you make your offer, you're making it contingent on suitable soils for conventional septic. And if you don't have that, then you got to negotiate a concession from the seller to offset that cost. And if they're not willing to do that, be prepared to walk away, because I'm here to tell you, there's no hiding from that cost. It's going to depress the value of that land. And if you have to go sell it on the other side and you're selling it, you have to disclose the fact that the soils are no good. And a lot of buyers who are less sophisticated, they won't even buy the land at all at any price. Now, sometimes the best part about owning land is getting closer to nature. But when you're closer to nature, sometimes you realize that nature has a mind of its own. Nature doesn't care about your plans at all. Reminds me of this 72 acres that we were in the process of buying in Kenansville, North Carolina. It's a local attorney that owns this land, and he owned another one down the road from it. We had a pretty good price to buy this land, and we were really eager about it because, as you can see, there's wetlands on the southern part of this property. It kind of backs into a swamp. But what we were really fortunate to find out in the process of due diligence is that you do have an area of suitable soil on the northwestern part of this property that enables you to put a septic system in to build a home on this land. So when you have that, you have a home site, but not only that, you have a 72-acre recreational paradise, a home site with recreational appeal for hunting, camping, fishing. You have like a national park in your backyard. So I thought that the land was really going to be marketable once we were able to buy it. But then there was a couple of things that we found out that weren't so great, because when we looked at the creek, the river that ran along the southern edge of that property, it met the road on the western boundary line of the property. The road frontage that we had abutted to a county road, but right next to that county road was the creek, and right next to that creek was wetlands. So what we realized is that the wetlands weren't exactly out of your way on this property, because the wetlands covered the area of ground that you would have to use for a future driveway to even get into that land. Now, with wetlands, as long as there's no year-round body of water and it's not considered waters of the United States, the wetlands are still regulated, but there's some forestry management standards that enable you to put a driveway in. As long as you meet some of the ecology and forestry management regulations, you can put a driveway in through wetlands that are not year-round standing water, but you have to follow certain guidelines. The issue is that it still adds a lot to the project. And if you're going to go and sell that land on the open market, you can have a PDF research report with all the state and local offices of all the officials that told you exactly what the steps were to build that driveway. But the thing is, your end buyer is not necessarily as sophisticated as you are. And so if you had to actually sell that land and we were in that property to try to flip it, we knew that you could build a driveway, but the problem is the end buyer is going to get squeamish. But not only that, what we also found out about this land is that between the time that we had signed the purchase agreement and we were about to close, as we were finding all this stuff out about the wetlands, the guy that owned that land timbered it. He had it clear-cut timbered, and he actually asked me to sign a release for the timber. I didn't even realize that he was going to clear-cut that land, because that's a huge amount of value. There's tens of thousands of dollars in timber value on that land. And so he left us with the husk of this property that had been totally clear-cut. The soil was torn up. Could we still install that septic system? Probably so, but the issue was when you got out on that property, it was so cut over, it was so thick, and there was so much organic debris and timber debris from the logging company that you actually had to watch your step, because you couldn't even see all the way to the ground. And when you would step, you would be stepping over big logs and down tree branches, and so it was actually really risky to even walk around and to actually clear that land. In order to build or clear a space to build that driveway or a home, you would have to spend days and days and days of time and effort trying to clear up all that debris. So the environmental issues on this land were too significant. We decided that we weren't going to buy it, because the fourth deal breaker when it comes to buying land is environmental issues. Do you have flood zone? Do you have wetlands? We're talking even extending that idea or slope. That's an environmental issue. Protected wildlife, conservation easements. These are environmental issues that impact your ability to use that land the way that you want to. So can you build on this land at all? What are the regulations? If so, who are the regulators? And how does that all impact your site plan? And is it actually worth doing? Because if you have wetlands and flood zone on the land that you're buying, it might not be the biggest deal in the world, because if you have those features, but you don't actually have to impact on the wetlands or flood zone when you're going to build, there's really no issue. Because if you're steering clear of these environmental issues with your site plan, then they're not really going to affect your site plan. But if they do, that's a deal breaker. One of the advantages of owning land is that, unlike owning a home or a rental property, you don't have to worry about maintenance. There's no tenants, there's no termites, there's no toilets or midnight calls about how the toilet's running. There's no repairs, there's no AC emergencies. There's none of that management stuff. But the thing is, when you're not paying attention to your land for too long of a period of time, there are some issues that have a way of rising up on your property. Take a look at this 43 acres that we were in the process of buying. It was so good. Kind of like a private easement access, but no access issues. You could drive drive into the property. It was real big, real private. You could put a home just about anywhere. Sandy soils, no issue putting a septic system in there. But when we sent our agent out to go look at the property to help us evaluate it before we closed the deal, we got this email that I've never seen before and I've never seen since. And in the email, what he told me is that this property is the neighborhood dump site. He told me I have never seen this much trash on a property ever before in my life. And he actually sent me a bunch of photos. We'll show you a couple of them here. Some of the photos he sent were bottles, cans, old clothing on trees. There's a bunch of these mystery piles that were like just piles of debris that were covered and caked in mold. There was just more tires than you've ever seen anywhere in your life. It was basically like the discard pile of like a Jiffy Lube that had been operating for 40 years and just throwing all this organic debris in the back. It was just a disaster. And we had a junk removal guy that went out there to quote the job of actually getting all the junk off the property. And what he told me is it was going to cost $25,000 just to clear the trash that he could see. See, what he told me is that there was no telling when they got into those trash piles how deep they went, how much stuff there was underground and what stuff there was. Because when you're starting to uncover these issues underground, I mean, you could find old oil drums, you could find old gasoline or discarded car batteries, you could find all types of environmental contaminants that forget about the cost of actually clearing it. You're talking about expensive state and federally mandated environmental remediation. So it's just a whole big nightmare. It's not the cost of what it takes to remove the junk on the surface. It's the fact that you don't know what's below the surface. So we ended up not buying this land because there was too much risk, and also because the fifth deal breaker is junk. If you find junk on the land that you're buying, find it before closing and make the seller clear it at their own expense. Or if there's a small enough amount of junk that you can quantify the cost of actually clearing it, get multiple contractors, junk removal specialists to quote the project and make sure they visit the site in person to give you real numbers. And make sure that if you have those numbers, round up a little bit, like add 15 or 20% and get the seller to give you a concession if you're going to do that after closing. But if it's too much junk or the junk that's there is too risky, don't buy it. Let me ask you this. Do you know the first 3 rules of real estate? That's right. Location, location, location. But knowing the first 3 rules is one thing because a lot of people don't know what the 4th rule is. The 4th rule of real estate is don't forget about the first 3 rules. Now, this is a property that we were in the process of buying a couple years ago. I loved it. I thought it was so good because this is a 14-acre property in Scotland County, North Carolina. I thought it had a great shape to it, had really good topography, but it also had 3 points of access. You have this subdivision and it wraps around the back of this subdivision, but you have 3 different roads that can get you into the interior of this property, which at the very least, what that means is that you have subdivide potential. You could easily cut this up into 3 or more properties because you have 3 or more individual driveways that you can use. Not only that, the soil map on this property was good because you had enough sandy soil where if you had to install a septic system, you could definitely do that in several different places. Plus you had a natural feature. When you look to the east of the property, you have that creek to the east. And then in between, you have a bunch of usable land with good access. So I thought it was really great, but the same realtor that went on the last property, that same day trip, he went out on this property too. But what he told me in his email was actually surprising. It was the last thing I ever expected to hear. And what he told me is, I rode into the neighborhood that the 14 acres is located in, but I turned around and left. He said, I would not leave my truck unattended in this area, and I would not be interested in selling it. He was like, you can try and buy it and sell it, but I don't want to list it. He doesn't want to list it. He doesn't want to be near it. He's not going to leave his car unattended near the land. And the issue why is because it was a bad neighborhood. I'm not talking about a low income, low price neighborhood. I'm talking about a war zone neighborhood. I'm talking about a neighborhood where like you can't leave stuff unattended if you ever want to be able to retrieve that stuff by the time you're done. See, there's all types of issues in this neighborhood that you can't see because on street view, it looks fairly innocuous, but it's not. You know, it's funny, the local news covered a story from a reverend that lives in this area. And he said that during the day, it's innocent enough, but at night, it's like a war zone. The gangs just take over. He lives about a mile away from this location. And what he said was that he came home with his wife. And when he was home inside of his house, he had heard footsteps. And by the time he realized what was going on, he realized there was a burglar inside his house. That burglar was like in the middle of a robbery, and it was an armed robbery too. They had a gun. So this burglar was like 15 feet away down the hallway from the reverend and his wife when they saw that he was there. And he turned and he emptied the clip in his handgun and he shot 19 rounds down the hallway at the reverend and his wife. And then when he shot through and had no more rounds in the chamber, he ran out. And the Reverend and his wife were just standing there. When they took inventory of what was going on, they realized that all the bullets missed them from point blank range. So if you don't believe in God after that, you're never going to believe in God. But the point is that the issue is not with Laurenburg in general, not with Scotland County in general, not with low income neighborhoods in general. None of that is what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is war zones. I'm talking about bad neighborhoods where there's real danger, real crime. This is one of those neighborhoods that you don't want to buy land because nobody's trying to buy homes or build homes in these neighborhoods. They're trying to get out of the homes that they already live in. They're trying to clear out, vacate, move on, do something else with their lives. Don't invest in neighborhoods that are uninvestable. The question that relates to the seventh deal breaker is, what good is owning land if you'll never be able to actually sell it? We're in the process of buying this 2-acre property in Warren County, North Carolina, from a guy named Lawrence. And the guy named Lawrence was our contact. He was the seller and the owner of record on the deed. The most recent version of the deed that had been recorded with that county said heirs of Polly Harris heirs. But the seller told us it's fine because he was the main heir, the only living heir of Polly Harris. So he was the one that had the right to sell the land. It makes sense because if your grandmother owned the land and that, you're the only grandson who's survived through the generations, then you're the rightful owner and you have the right to sell. But the problem is that's really not how inheritance works. That's not really how the law works. I mean, not that simply, because what happens when you're buying a piece of land is when you're going through a title company or a closing attorney, all they're going to see is when they run the title search, they're going to be like, okay, we need Polly Harris to sign the deed. Okay, well, Polly Harris is dead. Okay, does she have an estate? Okay, no, she doesn't. Are all the heirs accounted for? Well, there's this guy Lawrence. Who's Lawrence? Well, he's the grandson. Well, what about his dad? What about his mom? What about his aunts and uncles? What about their spouses? The fourth rule of buying land, guys, is all the heirs have to sign. See, when you have a property that is inherited, quote unquote, if you have an heir property, a property that is not actually owned in the name of the deeded owner, well, what happens is that you have to have the paperwork to transfer the ownership in between from the previous owner to the descendants, to the heirs of that property. There's billions of dollars of heir property across the United States that will never sell because the heirs all have to sign. And if you have a grandfather, grandmother that died, and if they don't have an estate, then every single generation that estate wasn't filed or resolved, then the heirship gets infinitely more complex because you have sons and daughters, you have their spouses, you have their children, you have their children's spouses, you have their children's in-laws, you have all this stuff and there's no paperwork. So if there's a guy named Lawrence at the end of a family tree, well then what about all the other branches? Because all the other branches of the family tree that emanate from the deeded owner are the heirs. So if all the heirs are not able to sign and they don't have the paperwork in terms of affidavits of heirship, in terms of estates or probate files, then you can't actually clear title to buy that land. I don't blame Lawrence for trying to sell it, but he should know better than to think that he could actually do that because anybody that will buy that land from him is going to get a title search. The title search is going to show that he's not Polly Harris. So the heirship needs to get accounted for and it's just not. And so the seventh deal breaker is title issues. Guys, there are heirship issues that are small that can be resolved. But if you have more than 3 heirs on a property, a piece of land you're buying, my advice to you is don't even try because it just tends not to work out. If it's very simple, you can work with a estate attorney in your state and they can do some paperwork here and there. Some of it takes time, some of it doesn't, depending on the specifics. But if you have more than 3 heirs, it's just not going to be worth the trouble. Always close with a title search. Make sure you have a title report plus title insurance before you actually buy that land, and you're going to be happy that you did. Speaking of which, the next video on our channel is going to expand on one of the stories that I mentioned on this particular video. It's called "This 30K Land Buying Mistake Will Shock You." And this is a good video because it talks about a lot of the other issues that are going to come up in the process of buying land and how you can negotiate around those issues successfully to account for the issue that the due diligence has uncovered and to make sure that you're buying that land at the right price.